and the formatting of the slides that I'm using today. This is my second year here at the University of Texas, and I have drunk the Kool-Aid, clearly, with the burnt orange and everything like that. You know, after the events of the last week, hopefully the Kool-Aid will not consume me, or us, or any of what we do. But that joke aside, I first read Anglos and Mexicans when I was 22 years old, in the fall of 1993. It was my initial months of living outside of South Texas for the first time ever. I was a first-year graduate student at what was then Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos. Now it's Texas State University in San Marcos. And still doing great work for the panel that we had before us with a student there. My undergraduate degree was from Texas A&I University in Kingsville, now Texas A&M University Kingsville, from the spring of 1993. I've sometimes thought that my readiness to accept colonialism as a very lived reality stems from the fact that I kind of experienced academic colonialism when I was at A&I, when my institution was kind of swallowed up by the A&M system, for whom I would later work for over 2 decades. So the relationship between I'll get off that. We're already getting off in a very self-indulgent, revelatory kind of thing. I read it in connection with a history course that I was taking under James Wilson, Tug Wilson, who's then at San Marcos, who would go on to direct my master's thesis. It was a course on the history of the Southwest. It involved very familiar U.S. Western and Southwestern authors, Dan Utley, Don Worster, David Weber, Patty Limerick. Anglos and Mexicans came up in our discussion. I had just read it. I was fired with enthusiasm for it. And I recall one student commented to me, "Oh, that's sociology. That's not history." That stuck in my mind, and I'm going to get to that point in a little bit. But I would just like to say that for me, Anglos and Mexicans was a revelation. It was the first Chicano history book that I ever read. But more importantly, the book unlocked something for me. It solved this mystery, this enigma of how I understood my own background, my growing sense of unease about how my home seemed so very profoundly different than the rest of the world I was learning about in graduate school. There was one moment that stood out early in the book where this unlocking, this cutting through the haze of not understanding my world and myself in it, it hit me like a thunderbolt. Next slide. It's this, the aforementioned cow and tractor map, the county reorganization map that Ben Johnson spoke about earlier. These cows and tractors were really cows and tractors of revelation for me. It's on page 134, for those of you who brought the book with you. It visually illustrates how a 7-county area from Corpus Christi to Laredo down to the Rio Grande Valley became a 12-county area between 1910 and 1921, with the use of these neat little cow tractor symbols to represent the main economic interests then clashing in those areas. This whole section contextualizes the violent clash of older, traditional, patron-oriented ranching economies with newer, white-dominated agricultural economies. These clashes involve not just partisan warfare, control of political offices, and the patronage that stemmed from them, but it also involved a social class, a conflict of two social structures that relate directly to the material conditions of production and labor. This conflict between old-time ranchers and new immigrant Anglo farmers would affect Mexicanos in different ways. Their subordinate position in society would in time decline even lower. Metaphorically speaking, the Tejanos in many parts of South Texas went from feudal peasants living on the land of their ancestors, taking and eating coffee from their porch, overlooking cattle, a small crop, the infinite sea of El Monte de Mesquite, to living in shacks of spare plank board that provided less protection from the elements and the pests than the traditional jacal, and sat on the edge of someone else's fields of cotton or fruit, ridden with toxic fertilizer, pesticides, and modern irrigation ditches. This discussion of Duval County boss Archie Parr that followed this map was really the first history I ever read that dealt with the stories of my youth. That's a picture of George Parr, the Duke of Duval, on your left, and that is the picture of my family's kind of ancestral place, La Mota de Olmos. It's a little ranch in near San Diego, Texas. I come from the small town of Freer, Texas, in Duval County. My mother was a Tejana of deep family roots in South Texas through the Basan and the Lopez family lines. My parents were public school teachers. They did not have money. I mean, I lived in a trailer house when I was a little kid, but because they were teachers in this small town, they had stature. They raised me with a passion for books, for questioning. I grew up happy, privileged, but happy in that sense. But I also grew up on stories from my grandmothers about the old days and what things were like. And I love these stories. Looking back, clearly, psychologically, I was geared to be a historian. When the other kids were outside playing, I wanted to sit with the viejitos around the table, drinking café and talking about, old tío so-and-so who did this, and remember the ranch and all this stuff. My maternal grandparents, Emilio and Juana Basan, of La Mota de Olmos Ranch, originally, in a rural part of Duval County, in between San Diego and Hemerville, near the town of Anniv. They were born at the turn of the 20th century to a world that was very different from the one that I grew up in. That's reflected kind of in the stories that I learned from them. I learned from my family a lot about the PAR political machine, but it was different than the official stories of corrupt men who lorded over the Mexicanos. My family stories, mostly from my mother, but also from my grandmother, were very affectionate. And that's, sometimes I've struggled with relating that, but they were affectionate. For example, the doctor provided by old man Archie Parr in the 1930s and the 1940s, a Dr. Dunlap of San Diego, Texas, who has a street named after him still in San Diego. Dr. Dunlap freely, without cost, cared for my mother and her older brother, my tío Juan, when they were newborns. Family lore credited Dr. Dunlap with saving their lives. I cannot emphasize what a big deal this was. My grandparents lost 4 other children who were stillborn or died within days of birth. Life was hard and health care was scarce to non-existent. But the county government never hassled my grandparents when the taxes were late or overdue. The police and the other local officials in Duval County were Tejano friends and relatives. The PAR machine supported the schools that they went to, the church they went to. My grandfather personally thought of George and Archie Parr like neighbors. He visited with them at fairs, at churches, at rodeos, cafes, the bank, the post office, you name it. If times were hard for my grandparents, my abuelos, they could always count on gifts of food, a job, or some other kind of assistance. There was no social safety net for Mexicanos back then, and all my abuelos had to do was vote the right way.
Right.
Was there a lack of opportunity for La Gente? Sure. Was there rank corruption in county and state funds?
We don't have to lay with our
absolutely. Were my familia and others like them taken advantage of? And that's important. Were they taken advantage of? Yes, of course they were. But that isolated rural Boss County was also a cocoon from some of the more negative forces of the outside world. My mother swore to me over and over that she never learned anything about Jim Crow or any kind of racial discrimination. She never experienced it until she left San Diego High School for college in Kingsville, Texas. And that jarred her tremendously. As a child, my mother even spoke Spanish in the public schools through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade without punishment, because the state was not about to step in to the PAR machine-dominated county schools and tell them how they're going to teach their kids. So, next slide, please.
It's real politics.
That is, I think, if there's a competition on who wins in terms of presentations, I think I win because that's a baby picture. Anytime you bust out the baby pictures, you win. Clearly, clearly I have outgrown my onesie, but you can see the little papalote in the background. You can see the tree underneath which the family ate al fresco. That's my mother, that's my father, that's my primo Georgie. Around 1970, which is when another figure associated with this conference would have been Yale, I believe. Is that right, Debbie?
1970, yeah.
Okay. Well, my own undergraduate years at A&I were great. Next slide, please. Couple little pictures of A&I. I grew up happy. I really immersed myself in my books. But I noticed that my dorm mates who came from places like Brownsville, Edinburgh, Crystal City, Raymondville, especially the kids from Kingsville, my goodness, they all had very different perspectives. They complained about how the schools were rigged with them. I found that hard to understand given my own background. They were very suspicious of and feared the police. That was incomprehensible to me in the little Chicano Mayberry that I kind of grew up in. My mental gears were grinding as an undergraduate with how I was so familiar with these dorm mates of mine, these kids that I was getting to know from other parts of South Texas, but how our perspectives were so different. Those gears that were grinding got unstuck in the fall of 1993 with the cow and tractor map. Oh, did we skip it? Okay, let's go back to the cow and tractor map. There we go. Those college friends went to tractor counties. I went to a cow county. It's a little visualization thing and probably an oversimplification, but as I read that section, getting back to 1993 and the rest of Professor Montejano's book, I kept thumbing back to that map and thinking, damn, my home, my life, my place, my stories make sense now. Now I can understand how it fits. That realization that hit me in 1993 would continue to hit me in future years. As I went through graduate school at Rice University, I learned all of these academic debates. The Hill-Gutman debate about interracial organizing in the US South and Alabama coal fields, the populist failures of the 1890s, the failures of socialism, why is there no socialist movement in the United States? I've been taught by all of these books and these scholars that I was reading about that those kinds of that kind of class formation and organization was always doomed because after all, race in the United States always trumps class. But I knew now, after reading Montejano, that's not true. Those scholars, those wonderful authors, they never read Anglos and Mexicans. They weren't familiar with Chicano history, and frankly, that was not surprising to me at all. As I went through graduate school, a big shout out to Emilia Zamora, who gave me my field in Chicano history at the University of Houston. When I went through graduate school, I realized that, this kind of history goes unknown, unacknowledged, and unloved, not just by historians, but among all the scholarly disciplines. That, after all, is why there are centers for Mexican American history and departments of Mexican American and Latino studies. Reading Montejano's work clarified for me that as real as racism was, it was also a social construction that came out of moments when economic forces and material conditions structured racial thought to rationalize the then developing practices of socioeconomic exploitation that would drive downward mobility for generations of Mexicanos, regardless of citizenship, in service to a predatory, unregulated capitalism that viewed farm workers as commodities to manage rather than as human beings to cherish. Anglos and Mexicans is not just a great history, but it shows how primary source research can illuminate ideas about race and other works. Let's skip to the Berkeley. There you go. David's more theoretically grounded interpretation was driven by census records and, of course, by archival documentation, particularly the Paul Taylor papers mentioned by Professor Gonzalez at the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley. I've made the pilgrimage here. Those papers are amazing. That record is incredible. Unlike my classmate at Southwest Texas State University, I did not see theory driving Anglos and Mexicans. Rather, I argue that the book's theoretical understanding provides a wider framework from which to view the devastating litany, a way to structure this devastating litany of social history facts contained within it. The middle sections of Anglos and Mexicans, Reconstruction and Segregation from 1900 to 1940, especially the chapters on the culture and geography of segregation, remain my favorite, are among the most extensively dog-eared and scribbled upon sections of my own paperback These sections show step by step how changing class conditions shaped the emerging and new racial systems of oppression. So, class can shape race, and it has. And frankly, we don't talk enough about that. Montejano's Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas favorably compares with another book that I would consider a little more theoretically driven, that is Rudy Acuña's Occupied America. Both books, Anglos and Mexicans and Occupied America, serve as an analogical echo of the famous Winthrop Jordan-Edmund Morgan debate about the origins of anti-Black racism in the U.S. Acuña viewed Chicano history through a strictly Marxist and nationalist lens in a way that feels to me, as I continue to reread it, quite structuralist. Like Acuña, Winthrop Jordan viewed the origins of anti-Black racism in the U.S. as deeply structural with very few points of contingency. It's very much the theory leading the facts. Montejano, in contrast, in his very title, steers away from cultural nationalism by viewing the Anglo-Mexican collaboration as a relationship with give and take on both sides, even though that give and take is uneven and fluctuating. It wasn't simply one-sided oppression. And like Morgan's counter to Jordan's thesis that demonstrates the emergence of the need for new labor force in the 17th century and how it activated racial thinking to serve its ends, Montejano shows the creation of racial ideology out of these loose ideational materials assembled with haste and purpose when profit demanded new ways to feed labor to the developing commercial plantation system. Only in this case, Montejano shows it in early 20th century farms of cotton, fruit, and vegetables in South Texas, rather than in Morgan's 17th century tobacco plantations of the colonial Chesapeake. David Montejano's Anglos and Mexicans emphasizes contingency and material conditions over ideology and overly structuralist thinking about the past. Final slide. And now we get to the complex political realities of that day in the 1980s. I will say, it didn't necessarily hit me when I was reading this, but as I've reread it, I've come to really appreciate the way in which David brings the past to the present in ways that does not allow the reader to turn off their critical gaze. I've written elsewhere that one of the defining elements of Chicano history is the vital, unapologetic connection between past and present in a way that makes history seem more active and activist. In a discussion of the eventual incorporation of Chicanos into the Texas Democratic Party in the early 1980s, on page 291, for anyone who wants to look it up, David demonstrates a perceptive intellectual balance. He turns to Rudy Acuña's cynical interpretation of the political success of then Mayor Henry Cisneros, seen here on your left, as the continuance of patron politics, just in a new century. David rejects this cynicism as cheap and easy. Then David picks up a testimonial by New York Governor Mario Cuomo, then the star of the National Democratic Party, where he gives a testimonial about San Antonio Congressman Representative Henry B. Gonzalez on your right, clearly one of David's favorites. Devoted soldiers, you know what I'm talking about. This is also because Cuomo argues in this testimonial, well, Henry did the hard, long work, arduous work of political inclusion. Montejano also takes issue with this kind of celebratory narrative too. Here, Anglos and Mexicans refuses the easy, tempting path of triumph. The book's narrative of declension is leavened somewhat by achievement, but clearly not enough. Once more, while neither Acuña nor Cuomo are entirely right, they're not entirely wrong. There was incorporation, there was inclusion, but it simply wasn't enough. And David was telling us that as early as 1986. As early as 1986, David was encouraging us to sit with this uncomfortable truth. This is a messier past, but it's also an honest look back. Though possessing passion, it also has an unflinching critical gaze. One could ask nothing more of a historian. In the current moment, ... as Ben mentioned a little bit earlier, we would do well to keep this balance of hope with honest criticism tightly in mind. In conclusion, and I am going to conclude, therapy session. Thank you for listening, by the way. Anglos and Mexicans at 40 years of age has changed the way the field operates in ways that are hard to describe. Many years ago, I assigned this to a class, and the student asked me, why is the book so important? Because we know all this stuff. Everyone just knows this stuff, right? And that's the great success of Anglos and Mexicans. Its ideas have sunk in so deeply that we now have difficulty thinking of the field without it. Thank you, David, for this book. The dreams and aspirations, the anhelos that you mentioned in your dedication have fired the imagination of generations of scholars. And if I could be permitted just a little bit of blasphemy here on a Friday afternoon, it's not the day for it, I know. We as scholars, everyone here, David, where are you? Are you back there?
Yeah.
There you are.
He's hiding in the back.
I'm here.
Where is it?
I was trying to maintain eye contact when I said this, but that's okay.
All right.
I mean, all of us here continue to build our temples of truth upon the strong foundation, the rock of Anglos and Mexicans in the making of Texas. Thank you.
I told David I have to read it. I have to get down. Now that you're smarter.
That's a tough act to follow. I didn't know. Chapters and verse, bring in the word. It really is an honor to serve or to participate in this conference, to be on this panel with folks. And one of the tough things about following up so many brilliant people on one book is they might have already taken everything that I was going to say. So if I repeat anything, which I might, because none of you heard me, bear with me. But thank you all so much for being here today. All right, so in 1974, a poem titled Los Académicos ran in the San Antonio-based Chicano journal, Caracol. It described academics as, and this is the quote, hocicos de iguana que se ahogan en su vómito. Miran acá. The poem and the poet demanded that academics look at his community, hoping they would see something other than people stereotypically living in conchas de taco and stuck in hojas de tamal. The problem was not the community or how they were living, but the learned professors who descended from their ivory towers to peer at and prod their sociological subjects lacked the vocabulary, possibly even the sociological imagination, to sufficiently explain the humans they trivialized or diminished. He concluded with a methodological questioning in the form of a warning, writing, ¿Qué palabras tienen para decir eso? Mierda de perro, no pises en mi tierra. Someone else can offer a translation. So, who was this angry person, and why was he so mad at social scientists? Well, it turns out this was a young graduate student, which explains their anger. He was Chicano, which explains the poetic imagery. And he was a young Chicano graduate student in the field of sociology, which explains the indignation directed at academics and social scientists more specifically. Sociology at mid-century was the science of society. Modernist sociology explained the way the world worked. It objectively and linearly explained the world as it was, as it is, and as it would be. Scholars like Milton Gordon described the assimilation process moving from generation to generation, occurring in stages, eventually moving from discrimination to assimilation. Walt Rostow organized the entire world into select stages of development, moving neatly from traditional to mature to high. And when groups or societies didn't proceed along the proper stages, then something had gone wrong. From the clearly demarcated linear stages of development, they were stuck in circular cultures of poverty, or so Oscar Lewis suggested. Typologies abounded, deciphering and defining messy individuals and groups. It was into this that a long-haired young grad student from the west side of San Anto arrived in New Haven with the intention of studying barrio vatos who organized themselves to protect their communities. From their world circumscribed by the very real limitations of their socioeconomic positions, underemployed, undereducated, over-policed, perceived as criminals and as unserious subjects unworthy of study, they worked to create a different world of potential and possibilities. And the sociologists of the world had no answer, no explanation. The brown berets had no place on their models. They had no place in society. They had no place in the world. The renowned futurist Wendell Bell struggled to make sense of these political vatos. There's no present and future in which he could make heads or tails of them. He wrote, "I'm afraid I don't know enough about this kind of analysis to make very useful suggestions." The esteemed Western Marxist and Berkeley professor Leo Lowenthal wondered whether the brown berets were all illegal immigrants. And so when the angry young poet asked what words academics had to explain his community, it wasn't just a poetic or rhetorical device. It was an epistemological dilemma. That young poet, of course, was David Montejano. He had a career as a poet. And he was realizing that he would have to write the words, build the theoretical scaffolding, and create the knowledge needed to describe his community. In the Brown Berets, Montejano believed he had found the interpretive key. He could develop the model that demonstrated how the underclass became politically conscious and organized. Through his research, his dissertation on the Berets would provide the path that the lumpen traveled to become agents of social change. He could and would explain how these vatos went from being local to being political. It would all work out neatly until it didn't. The vatos and rucas of San Anto in the Southwest didn't populate easily into social science models. They didn't fit the typologies. In order to populate the brown berets into the world as it was, he had to go back and explain how that world came to be. That work became Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas. In Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, Montejano had to both theorize and historicize social change. Anglos and Mexicans taught multiple fields how to interpret Southwestern history. We're giving chapter and verse out. Check out the appendices, on interpreting Southwestern history or on interpreting the Chicano movement. By pushing against the historically blind explanations of cultural deficiency and structural determinism that prevailed in the field of sociology. Ethnic Mexicans weren't poor because of inferior cultures, deviance, or a pre-modern orientation incompatible with capitalism. And for historians, they might have to remember something other than the Alamo, or that Texas was not wholly Southern. Social relations between Mexican and Anglos had developed over time in response to changing economic conditions. At times, Tejanos held economic and political power, and Anglos had to peacefully accommodate the Tejano ranch society. Later, industrial capitalism reorganized society and labor, especially in Texas, in the shape of industrial agriculture. In this new economic form, segregation became essential for agricultural production. The factories in the field needed their workers and needed the underlying justification to pay them poorly. The history of ethnic Mexicans in the U.S. then was not just a story of the Chicano struggle toward liberation or just an unbroken legacy of conquest. It was much more complex and dynamic history, a drama with a cast filled with more than just villains and victims. The perspective-shifting possibilities of historical sociology or sociological history help to see the whole story. At times, a telescopic view was needed, requiring a 150-year field of vision. At others, a microscopic view was required, with a 15-year or 7-month range of vision. In this insight, Montejano reconciled the raging internal colonial versus industrialization debate in early Chicano historiography. Balancing all of this was not easy. He wrote, "The distinct obligations carried by a commitment to history and sociology at times were difficult to manage. It meant working on two fronts, balancing energies and emphases and blending the two into a coherent synthesis. This was risky business." Exploring the political edge with the Brown Berets had put him out on a methodological ledge, which he shared with many in the growing field of Chicana and Chicano studies. Early activists and academics knew that the communities were complex and that individual disciplinary tools would be too simple. Chicanas and Chicanos needed a full toolbox if they were to diagnose or explain the connection between past and present. The field was often interdisciplinary too because it had to cobble together interpretive frameworks, dissertation committees, and fields of study. Scholars who wanted to study Chicana and Chicano literature often ended up studying or writing dissertations on Spanish peninsular literatures before embarking on their own. Chicana and Chicanos who wanted to study Chicana and Chicano history often studied with Latin Americanists, with materialist bents, or historians of the U.S. West. Chicanas were often told that their history didn't exist at all, and that there was nothing about them in the archives. They would develop over time their own lenses to read documents and see the histories that were indeed there in front of them, if anyone cared to look. Anglos and Mexicans continued this venerable tradition of interdisciplinarity in Chicana and Chicanic studies. Chicanos like Montejano cursed the academicos for the lack of vocabularies or imaginations, and then went on to show them how it was done. Fast forward to the spring of 2004, a young, not quite as angry, not quite as long-haired undergraduate walked into a class by pure circumstance, but really kismet. I had followed my sister to Trinity University in San Antonio, but I had no illusions of graduating. I had applied and attended college purely to appease my mother. My goal was to drop out and become a rock star here in Austin. But there's still hope, yeah, that's right. But in order to make my plans work, I needed to make it appear that I had given it the old college try. I couldn't drop out too soon. And so I had a bad registration time and needed to add another class for my full-time student status. My sister had previously taken a first-year seminar with Arturo Madrid, who was at Trinity University at the time, and he was teaching a class called the U.S. Latino Experience. She told me how to get a pink slip and go get added to the class, and she assured me that if I told him I was her little baby brother, that he'd let me into his class. I followed her advice like I always do, and Dr. Madrid did indeed let me into his class. It just so happened that in that class, he assigned Anglos and Mexicans in the making of Texas. I couldn't put it down. It wasn't just history, and just like many folks here on these panels have said, it was revelatory. It was a revelation. One day after class, I waited for everyone to leave, and then approached Dr. Madrid. I held the book, and I asked, "Is this true?" He assured me it was. Well, I never became a rock star. And I never dropped out of college. After that class, fortunately or unfortunately, I was hooked. I needed to read more. I wanted to learn more. Anglos and Mexicans helped explain so much of what previously I had no vocabulary for.
Class analysis.
The family stories told around tables while drinking coffees and little cafecitos began to make sense. And I wondered if I too could do what someone like David Montejano did. Maybe I too could be a historian. So I headed off to graduate school to get some discipline or just disciplinary training. Yet I found myself frustrated. After reading works like Anglos and Mexicans, the books in graduate school still felt stifling. There was a disciplinary rigidity in the works of history that I was reading that hadn't been present in my previous training. Now, this didn't mean that Chicana and Chicano studies lacked academic discipline, but it was epistemologically omnivorous in its hunger for knowledge. As a budding interdisciplinary historian, I eventually realized, with the help of my advisor, that I was a historian of ideas, but the history of ideas that I was interested in was still not present. In the major surveys, key textbooks, crucial periodization, ethnic Mexicans and U.S. Latinas, Latinos, and Latinxes in general were completely absent. Early on, conservative and rigid definitions of intellectuals kept historians from exploring ethnic Mexican intellectual history. By the early 21st century, more of its practitioners were open to a wider collection of ideas and thinkers, but not many had yet ventured into Aztlán or even into Nepantla. The questions I was asking, the sources I was using weren't exactly what the larger field was using, and it was disorienting for a graduate student. To paraphrase or borrow a phrase of Raúl Coronado when he was looking at his 19th century study of Texas, he says he went looking for literature and found politics. In my
That's what I
research,
thought he
I
was
was
gonna
looking
talk
for
about.
politics
Right.
and I found poetry. I would find my ideas in these poems. I dove into Caracol and Tejidos and Grito and the many publications of small Chicano publishing houses. I wasn't sure what I was doing was actually intellectual history. Sometimes I wasn't sure what I was doing was history at all. But the example of Anglos and Mexicans gave me confidence to keep doing the work that I wanted to do. And at the very least, I wouldn't abandon my dissertation topic for 40 years. So, while in graduate school, I learned that academics deliver papers. I applied to deliver a paper at the Nax Tejas conference that was here at UT. It was one of my first, I think either my first or my second, but it was very early on. And so when I showed up to my panel, it wasn't in one of the regular meeting rooms. It was in one of the larger ballrooms with many chairs set up. The speakers were put up on a dais, and I found myself sitting next to David Montejano, presenting to a large crowd, probably one of the largest crowds I've ever presented to at an academic conference. Clearly, then and now, those large crowds are still showing up for me. I've been riding my coattails.
Rock star.
I made it, you're right. So, 40 years since its initial publication, Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas is still an important work. It stands as a clear example of the epistemological power and potential of our field. In order to explain what the vatos and rucas of his barrio were doing and how they were able to do it, Montejano had to explain how the social systems that define Anglo and Mexican relations in Texas took shape, over what time and why. It didn't just happen. It hadn't always been that way. It wasn't just an arrested stage in a unidirectional movement of individuals and societies. Over more than a century, capitalism and racism worked in tandem to create a social and economic structure meant to alienate and extract, racialize and exclude. At the end of his book, he intones that the system created most powerfully between 1900 and 1930 was unmade during the post-war years, and especially through the Chicano movement. The ideological architecture and economic structures of exclusion were disassembled by generations of ethnic Mexican activists. But importantly, it was a national movement of working-class youth who, quixotically, in his words, motivated by a righteous belief in a cause or a vision and taken with little concern for tactical success, that believed they could change the world, even when others told them they couldn't. And not only did they believe they could, they did. Unos vatos se fueron para Yale, otros y otras se quedaron más cerquitas, staying close in Austin and San Antonio, others in their neighborhoods near Berkeley and UCLA, and some spent their whole careers at places like Cal State Northridge. But they all changed the world around them. Anglos and Mexicans challenged the fields of sociology and history, but it might have also suffered from the lingering optimism of mid-century. Whether it was the discipline, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, or the sunset age of Aztlan, the study left the impression that the system once disassembled would never be built anew. 40 years after its publication, we live in times where we see the structures of exclusion and oppression being reassembled on the horizon. Reading David Montejano's trilogy, and especially Anglos and Mexicans, gives us a sense of what we should do when we see those structures rebuilt. Tilt, vatos, tilt.
Thank you. So we have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. I wanted to kick us off with a question, thinking about discipline and genre. You all touched a bit on Anglos and Mexicans as a work of sociology, but we're in a room full of packed with historians. Why is that, or why do you all think that is?
I mean, right, he called himself a historical sociologist in sociological history, so it was important to both. In really important ways in both those fields, it was making significant intervention, right? It was displacing kind of that modernist and presentist blindness in the field of sociology, and then it was adding these other dimensions with in history. why this room's filled with a bunch of historians who are still reading it.
Yeah.
Do sociologists still read it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think to kind of get at the question a slightly different way, when you're talking about Chicano and Chicana history, this is a history that was, I mean, you could say it was discovered or it was created in the late 1960s and 1970s. But frankly, those historians were not making anything up. That history was always there. It was just unremarked upon. It was obscured. It was hidden. It was forgotten. And I think when you're dealing with something that is not supposed to exist, we use all the tools, the intellectual tools at our disposal. And I think sociological theory is one of those tools that I think could help contextualize what was happening and add structure to it. And I think that, yes, there's a lot of structure to this, but I think there's a lot of contingency too. I would argue that the work is more history than it is sociological, but we can have different reads too.
So there had always been historical sociology. But I think that we need to recognize the history that I was pointing out to. That is, the social sciences were more prepared to address the issues that were arising at that particular time. History was a little bit slower to do that. And so it made sense. I mean, we members of CHPEC felt the necessity of applying what was going on sociologically to our history, because we intuited histories in which social inequality, social subordination, and oppression had lasted through time. There was no period in Chicano history in which we had a glorified richness and upper classes. We weren't that stratified. And so I think that goes a long way towards explaining the fact that we have historian, sociology, social scientists, also people in education. I mean, they were also dealing with these kinds of questions at that very time. And so I think it was kind of natural that history would arise as an important topic for us to address if we were going to address these very serious issues that were happening to our people.
Thank you. All right, we can take a couple of audience questions. I saw Cynthia's hand first.
With regards to Felipe's presentation, you had a list of Chicana feminist scholars at UC Berkeley, and it's also important to inform everybody that there was an important Chicana feminist scholar group there called Mujeres en Marcha, Mujeres on the Move or on the March. And the rumors were that the men were saying, Mujeres en Marcha, hombres corriendo. men running away. And I just want to say that David Montejano was one of those men running away, and that's why he was gone to Texas.
So,
I have to respond. And I'm sorry, Felipe ran out of time. We could have talked more about the history of the collective we had called CHPEC. It was very important. It existed for a number of years. We met regularly. We exchanged papers, criticized each other. Women were an integral part of the group. But the women at the end said, what about gender? When are we going to talk about gender? The men started talking about gender. The women said, no, we women are going to talk about gender. And the women, frustrated with us, left and formed their own group called Mujeres en Marcha.
Yeah.
And so we still kept having CHPEC meetings, but the women weren't showing up. It was just the guys. And so that's when Alex Zaragoza said, let's rename ourselves Hombres Corriendo. But most came out of the CHPEC experience. And CHPEC germinated many different kind of projects.
I just want to point out that Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social,
MOX.
MUGS, officially got organized at UC Davis. But the roots of it were actually in Berkeley. It was some of the Chicanas who were on my list there who started Mujeres en Marcha, and that evolved into MUG. So I think that's another point of, I get really in the weeds when it comes to historical facts, and I just wanted to point that out.
Any other audience questions?
So I promised I would ask all of the professors that are presenting today this question, but as I said this morning, the periods in the book are roughly 40 years long, each of them. It's been 40 years since 1986, and so if any of y'all were going to write an afterword, so to speak, to Anglos and Mexicans, 1986 to 2026, what's in there? That's it. That's the question. What's in there?
Well, I don't know how to tell you this, but the vast majority of gentes of Mexican origin are still in the working class. And we still have a long way to go. And so that has to be part of the discourse. And there does have to be greater attention to the kinds of lives that our gentes are experiencing these days. And so Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas was a very important milestone in that whole journey. We have to get back to it on a much more systematic basis than what we have been doing.
That's a great question, Ethan. So I thought about it a little bit. I think there's a book that was written about 20, 25 years ago, The Illusion of Inclusion. On San Antonio politics. I forget the poet.
Rosales.
Yeah.
The illusion of
The Illusion of Inclusion. And I always liked that title, right? I thought the book was okay, right? The book was good. But no, it was good. It was good. But I like, it's not Anglos and Mexicans. We'll leave it at that. But I love the title because I think that inclusion without equality or inclusion without justice is illusory.
Right.
And I'm not sure exactly how that translates to everyday life, but as a principle, I think that this era that we have had in which this kind of superficial level of inclusion, respect, honor, which by the way over the last week is dissipating rapidly, at least on this campus, I don't know about elsewhere, but without actual more structural change in justice and equality, then it becomes hollow. It becomes a little more rhetorical. And that's challenging, but as I mentioned before about David's ending, which I would argue, contrary to others who presented on it, I find that ending of Anglos and Mexicans more ambivalent. I read more ambivalence in that than I read uncritical triumph. And I think that's a good lesson for us today, that all's not lost, but there's obviously a lot of work to be done.
Your question, Ethan, made me think, because I had just finished last year teaching a class that I created called Latino since the 1970s, and I was like, oh crap, what did I say? Right, I think going with the ION themes in there, I think deindustrialization would be a good part because it follows that kind of track of capitalist development, right? And so if industrialization is defining these key developments, then deindustrialization is a major change. And it reminds me of a part in the last section of that book that David mentions a storied conversation between Mari Maverick and Gus Garcia, right? And they're arguing, I forget which hotel down in San Antonio, and he says, you damn gringos can have the Alamo, we Mexicans want Kelly Field. And this is that kind of hopeful note that comes by the 50s and 60s of increasing, right? Like that they want those jobs in Kellyfield, but we know in San Antonio that Kellyfield closes, right? And we know in Kellyfield that they weren't getting promoted, right? And so all these issues then get exacerbated by deindustrialization and globalization. So whether I define it, I mean, in the class I see those as 2 distinct processes, but if I had a name like that, if Alvarez Sanchez writes the updated edition of this, which I don't want to, I might have it as deindustrialization.
I don't think I need that, but I guess what I wanted, the situation that's happening at UT is what you're talking about, Dr. Blanton. You know, that we have inclusion, well, we have what? Was that the title? Inclusion. The illusion of inclusion. And I think, to me, I think a lot of it has to do that when we were being included, and this is just one area, the university, there's a lot of others, business, business, medical, etc. When we were being included, it was at the university, it was a dynamic relationship between community and the institution, and unfortunately, very few of us remained in that relationship, and thinking about it now, for this particular segment, and that's just one segment of our community, is a university segment, I think going forward, we should require that every faculty member be related to the community in some way. I mean, to me, and of course, it's not just the university, it's everywhere where we are seeing development of our community in business. For example, I see our businesses, we support them like 1 in a million. I want to tell you guys, do not go there. They're Republican, I mean, we made them rich, and then what do? They turn on us, and we continue to support them. And so what I'm saying is, if we can find a dynamic way of connecting the vulnerable that continue to be, that have to struggle to somehow get to where we are, like we struggle to get to where we are, those of us that are here have that responsibility. And so I'm just saying, for the university community going forward, if you're a faculty member and you're not connected in one way or another to a community-based organization, you shouldn't have this job. I'm done, Aquí en la universidad hay 5 personas perhaps that we know, work with the community. So, I mean, that's just my preach for the day. Because,
Thank you. One last big thank you to our panel.